My wife told me. I think I've outgrown this marriage. I listened carefully, agreed without resistance, and focused on moving forward. Months later, when she reached out again, the life I had built quietly didn't include the chapter she wanted back. I think I've outgrown this marriage. She said it the way someone reads a grocery list out loud. Calm, rehearsed, already moved on before the words even finished landing. I was standing at the kitchen counter, still holding my coffee mug. The steam was curling up between us like it was trying to soften something that couldn't be softened. I didn't drop the mug. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there for a long moment, and then I set the mug down very slowly, the way you set something down when you're trying not to break it. Okay, I said. Not okay like I agreed. Not okay like I was defeated. Just okay. Like I finally heard something clearly that had been trying to reach me through static for a very long time. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. We were 34 and 32, married 6 years, living in a 2-bedroom house on the quieter side of Portland, in a neighborhood where people jogged with strollers and waved at each other from driveways. From the outside, we were fine. From the inside, we had been 2 people sitting in the same room staring at different walls for longer than either of us had been willing to say out loud. Her name was Claire. And when Claire made up her mind about something, she didn't circle it. She walked straight through it like a door she'd already measured twice. I'd admired that about her once. Standing there in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, I realized I was on the wrong side of that quality. She wasn't asking me a question. She wasn't opening a conversation. She was closing one that apparently she'd been having with herself for months, maybe longer. I've been thinking about this for a while, she said. And she leaned against the refrigerator with her arms crossed, not hostile, just closed. I know, I said. And I did know. I just hadn't said it first. She looked at me then like she wasn't sure what to do with a man who didn't fight, who didn't beg, who didn't make her feel guilty for saying the things she'd needed to say. You're not going to argue with me? She asked. Would it change anything? I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no. Then let's figure out what comes next, I said. And I picked my coffee back up and walked to the living room window and looked out at the yard where the oak tree had dropped half its leaves overnight. What happened next was what you'd expect, and also nothing like what you'd expect. There were lawyers, not angry, not drawn out, just paperwork and quiet phone calls and the slow mechanical process of untangling 2 lives that had been woven together for 6 years. There were weekends where I packed boxes in the spare room while she was out. There were evenings where we passed each other in the hallway and nodded like co-workers who respected each other but didn't have much to say. There was a night, about 3 weeks in, where she came downstairs at 11:30 and sat at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while. I was heating up leftover soup. I asked if she wanted a bowl. She said yes. We sat there and ate soup in silence, and it was the most honest thing we'd shared in probably 2 years. Neither of us talked about the divorce. Neither of us talked about anything, really. But there was something in that silence that felt like the first real conversation we'd had in a long time. 2 people being exactly where they were without pretending to be somewhere else. When she went back upstairs, I stayed and washed both bowls. I remember thinking, this is what it looks like when something ends with dignity. Not without sadness, just without destruction. She moved out on a Saturday in October. Her brother came with a truck. His name was Neil, and Neil had never particularly warmed to me. So he kept his eyes on the boxes and his conversation aimed at Claire. I helped carry things anyway. Not because I had to. Because it felt like the right way to close a door, with both hands, deliberately, without slamming it. When the truck pulled away, I stood on the front porch for a few minutes. The street was quiet. A neighbor across the road was raking leaves, and he raised his hand in that wordless greeting people exchange when they don't have anything to say but want to acknowledge that they see you. I raised my hand back. Then I went inside. The house felt bigger than it was. Not in a devastating way, in an honest way. Like a room that finally showed you its real dimensions after the furniture had been rearranged for years to hide them. Here is the part that surprises people when I tell this story. I didn't fall apart. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story that would be easier to tell, the version where I spent weeks in the dark, didn't shower, called in sick to work, and stared at old photos, that's not what happened. What happened was, I got very quiet. And in that quiet, I started paying attention to things I hadn't paid attention to in years. I noticed that I hadn't called my friend Derek in almost 8 months. I noticed that the gym membership I'd been paying for since before we got married had been untouched for 2 years. I noticed that there was a woodworking class at the community center on Tuesday evenings that I'd bookmarked on my phone and then ignored for so long that the page had expired. I noticed that the last time I'd gone hiking, really hiking, full day, pack on my back, no phone signal, was in 2018. These weren't dramatic realizations. They were quiet ones. But quiet realizations have a way of accumulating into something that changes the shape of your days. The first thing I did was call Derek. He answered on the second ring like no time had passed and said, "Man, I was starting to think you fell into a ditch." I laughed. Not a polished laugh, the kind that comes out of somewhere you forgot existed. "Something like that," I said. We talked for 2 hours that night. About nothing important and everything important. He told me about his new apartment, his dog, the terrible date he'd been on the week before where the woman had spent 40 minutes talking about her ex-husband's boat. I told him about Claire, about the kitchen, the coffee, the soup at 11:30. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "How are you actually doing?" And I thought about it for a real second before I answered. "I think I'm okay," I said. "Not the polite kind of okay. Actually okay." "That's either really healthy," Derek said, "or it's going to hit you in 3 months like a freight train." "Could be both," I said. "Could be both," he agreed. I re-signed up for the gym 2 days later. I went at 6 in the morning, before work, when it was mostly empty and the only sounds were the low hum of treadmills and the occasional clank of someone putting weights back wrong. I was out of shape in the quiet way that sneaks up on you. Not catastrophically, just softly, the way erosion works. I didn't push hard the first few weeks. I just showed up. Every morning. Whether I felt like it or not. There is something that happens in your body when you start keeping small promises to yourself after a long period of not keeping them. It doesn't happen all at once. But slowly, like lights coming on in a house, room by room, something starts warming up from the inside. The woodworking class had a new session starting in November. I signed up on a Wednesday, showed up the following Tuesday, and spent 3 hours learning how to properly hold a hand plane from a man named Weston, who was 61 years old, completely unbothered by everything, and had the kind of steady hands that suggested he'd been making peace with time for a long while. I was terrible at it. I mean, actually, laughably terrible. My first attempt at a basic box joint looked like something a tired child had done with a butter knife. Weston stood beside me, studied it for a moment, and said, "Well, it's a start." "Is it though?" I said. He laughed. "Everything's a start," he said. "The question is whether you come back next week." I came back next week. And the week after that. And the week after that. Work settled into a new rhythm. I had been a project manager at an infrastructure consulting firm for 4 years, the kind of job that fills your calendar and empties your head if you let it. I had let it. For a while, the busyness had been useful, something to pour myself into when the house felt like a waiting room. But now I started approaching work differently. Not harder, more deliberately. I started finishing what I started before moving to the next thing. I started saying no to meetings that didn't need me in them. I started eating lunch away from my desk and actually tasting the food. Small shifts. But small shifts in direction, sustained long enough, end up taking you somewhere entirely different than where you were heading. Somewhere around month 2, something became very clear to me. I had been unhappy in that marriage for longer than I had admitted to myself. Not miserable, unhappy. There's a difference. Miserable is loud and obvious. Unhappy is quiet. Unhappy is the feeling of going through the right motions and wondering why none of them feel like yours anymore. Unhappy is eating soup at 11:30 and that being the most connected you've felt to another person in months. I didn't blame Claire for saying what she said. I didn't blame myself, either. We had outgrown the same thing. She had just been willing to name it first. The holidays came. This is the part people always assume is the hardest. Your first Thanksgiving alone. Your first Christmas morning where the house is quiet in a way that doesn't feel like peace. It was hard. I won't pretend otherwise. But it was also clarifying. I drove 4 hours north to spend Thanksgiving with my parents and my younger sister Brooke and her husband and their 2 kids. My mother didn't make a production out of the divorce. She just hugged me when I walked in the door and held on a second longer than usual. My dad shook my hand and said, "Good to have you," in the voice that meant he was glad I was there, and also that we weren't going to discuss anything heavy before the meal. I was deeply grateful for both of those things. We ate too much, and my nephew showed me a card trick he'd been practicing, and I sat on the back porch with my sister after dinner, and she said, very simply, "She wasn't right for you. She was never quite right for you." I didn't argue with that. "I know," I said. "How long have you known?" she asked. I looked out at the yard for a moment. A while, I said. She nodded. We sat out there until it got cold, and then we went inside and had pie. January arrived like someone opening a window. Cold, abrupt, clarifying. The divorce was finalized in the second week of the month. No drama. No final confrontation. Just a signature and the particular silence that follows the end of something significant. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot of the attorney's office for about 10 minutes after. Not crying. Not numb. Just sitting. Taking stock of the fact that a chapter had formally closed, and that the page was blank, and that I was the one holding the pen. Then I started the car and drove to the hardware store because I needed sandpaper for the box I was building in woodworking class. February is when things started to shift in a way I hadn't planned and hadn't been looking for. I was at a Saturday morning farmer's market 3 blocks from my house, something I'd started doing partly because it forced me to leave the house and partly because I developed an inexplicable interest in good bread now that I was feeding only myself. I was standing in line at a honey vendor, studying the labels with an intensity that was slightly excessive for a person who only wanted something to put on toast, when a woman next to me said, "The wildflower is better than it sounds." I looked up. Her name was Nina. I didn't know that yet. She was holding a jar of clover honey, head tilted, with the expression of someone who was genuinely invested in helping a stranger make a good decision. "I always go for the buckwheat," she said, "but people either love it or they find it too strong. The wildflower is a safe middle ground." "Are you a honey expert?" I asked. "I'm a teacher who shops here every Saturday," she said. "So I've had a lot of time to develop opinions." I got the wildflower honey. She was right. It was very good. We ran into each other at the same market the following Saturday, and the one after that. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th coincidence, it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a standing appointment neither of us had formally agreed to. We started getting coffee after. Nina taught 4th grade at the elementary school 6 blocks from my house. She read constantly, the kind of person who always had a book in a bag, who recommended things with genuine enthusiasm and then wanted to actually talk about them afterward. She had been divorced for 2 years herself. We didn't spend our early conversations excavating our past relationships. We both seemed to instinctively understand that there was something slightly off about people who use new connections as confession booths for old pain. We talked about books and bread and the strange particular satisfaction of farmers markets. We talked about a documentary we'd both seen independently about deep-sea creatures. We talked about the fact that Portland winters have a specific quality of gray that is either oppressive or quietly beautiful, depending on your current state of mind. "Which is it for you right now?" she asked one morning. I considered the question seriously. "Quietly beautiful," I said. She smiled. "Me too," she said. I want to be careful here, because this story isn't about Nina as the replacement or the reward. That's not the point. The point is that I had been putting in quiet, consistent work on myself. Not for anyone else, not to prove anything, not to get something. And that work had made me into someone who could actually be present in a moment, in a conversation, in a life, without one eye always looking backward. Nina was part of a larger picture. A picture I was building slowly, panel by panel. The woodworking class, the gym, the Saturday markets, the long Sunday hikes I'd started doing on trails outside the city. The promotions I'd earned at work because I was finally operating at something close to my actual capacity. The apartment I'd started looking at because I'd decided that the house, which I could afford to keep, no longer needed to be kept. It held the shape of something I was done with. I wanted to build from a blank floor plan. I found an apartment in March. Top floor, corner unit, floor-to-ceiling windows that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that felt, the first time I stood in the empty space, like the building had been designed specifically to remind you that days begin. I signed the lease on a Thursday. I told Derek about it over the phone, and he said, "Man, who are you?" "Someone who found out what he actually wanted," I said. "Which is?" I thought about it. "Mornings," I said. He was quiet for a second. "Okay," he said. "I don't fully understand that, but it sounds good." I moved in on a Friday in late March. I had very little furniture. A bed, a couch I'd bought secondhand that was good in the way that old, broken-in things are good. A kitchen table I had actually built myself, not in the woodworking class, just in my garage in the final weeks before the house went on the market. My first real solo project, simple and slightly imperfect, and completely mine. The apartment felt large and honest and full of the particular potential that empty rooms have before life arranges itself in them. I stood at the east window with a mug of coffee on that first morning and watched the city come to light and thought about almost nothing at all. It was one of the better mornings I could remember. April passed. May came in warm, earlier than usual. I was promoted at work in May, a move that had been in conversation for a while, but that I'd been too flattened by the previous 2 years to fully pursue. Now I was pursuing things. Deliberately, without apology. Derek visited for a long weekend and I cooked dinner. Actually cooked, not reheated. And he sat at my kitchen table and ran his hand over the wood and said, "You made this." "I made that," I said. He nodded slowly. "I feel like you went through some kind of portal," he said. "You mean the divorce?" "I mean everything after it," he said. "The divorce was just the door." I thought about that. He was right. The divorce was just the door. June was when Claire called. I want to be clear about the timeline, because it matters. It had been 8 months since she walked out of the house with her brother and a rented truck. 7 months since the papers were signed. 4 months since I moved into the apartment. I had talked to her exactly once in all of that time. A brief email exchange in February about a piece of furniture we'd bought together that she wanted and I didn't care to keep. That was it. So when my phone lit up on a Tuesday evening in June with her name, I looked at it for a moment before answering. Not with dread, not with hope, just consideration. "Hey," she said when I picked up. "Hey," I said. "I've been thinking about calling for a while," she said. "Okay," I said. There was a pause. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Genuinely good." "You?" She paused again, a beat too long. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said. I waited. "I think I made a mistake," she said. I didn't say anything for a moment. Not because I was composing a response, because I was making sure I actually understood what I was hearing. "What kind of mistake?" I asked. "Us," she said. "The marriage. I think I wasn't seeing things clearly. I think I was in a place where everything felt like it was suffocating me and I made a choice that I can't stop second-guessing." She said it with the kind of precision that told me she'd rehearsed this part. "I've missed you," she said. "And I've missed what we had." I sat down on the edge of my couch. Outside, through the big east window, the evening sky was still holding light. A bird I'd never learned the name of was making its sound from somewhere in the trees below. I thought, very clearly, about the soup at 11:30, about the truck pulling away in October, about waking up the morning after she left and making coffee and standing at the window and realizing, slowly, that the tightness in my chest that I had gotten so used to I'd stopped noticing it, was gone. "I don't think you made a mistake," I said. She went quiet. "I think you were honest about what you needed," I said. "And I think it was the right call. For both of us." "You don't know that," she said. "I think I do," I said. "I know what the last couple of years felt like. I know what this year has felt like. They're not comparable." "Are you saying you're happy?" she said. And there was something in her voice. Not anger, not hurt exactly, but the particular bewilderment of someone who expected a different script. "Yeah," I said. "I'm saying I'm happy." Another long pause. "With someone?" she asked. "With my life," I said. I should tell you what it felt like on her end. Because I found out later, through mutual acquaintances, through the way information always finds its way back, that Claire had spent those 8 months doing what a lot of people do when they leave a relationship convinced they're outgrowing it. She discovered that what she'd been outgrowing wasn't the marriage. It was herself, or rather, the version of herself that she'd never been comfortable sitting still with. She'd moved into a new apartment. She'd thrown herself into the social life she'd told herself our marriage was keeping her from. And some of it had been good. And some of it had been the kind of freedom that turns out to be lonelier than the constraint you left. She'd started going to therapy, which I genuinely respected. But in therapy, apparently, she'd started to understand something she hadn't wanted to look at before, that the dissatisfaction she'd attributed to us had been trailing her from a long time before us. That it had found a home in our marriage only because that's where she'd parked herself. That outgrowing a marriage and outgrowing yourself are two very different things, and she'd confused them. I'm not telling this to make her the villain. There are no villains here. I'm telling it because it's part of what makes the story true. "Is there any possibility?" she started. "Claire," I said. She stopped. "I don't say this with any cruelty," I said, and I meant that completely. "But no, there isn't." "Just like that," she said. "Not just like that," I said. "After everything that came between then and now." "What came between then and now?" she said. "A life," I said. "I built a life." She was quiet. "I didn't wait for you to come back," I said. "Not because I was angry, because you told me clearly where you stood, and I believed you, and I started from there." She said, "I wish you'd fought for it." and that landed in me like a stone into still water. I waited for the ripples to settle before I spoke. If I'd fought for it, I said, you would have resented me for not hearing you. You know that. She didn't answer. I heard you, I said, clearly, and I respected what you said. And then I went and built something from the ground up. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not asking you to apologize, she said. Then what are you asking? I said. A long silence. I don't know, she admitted. And there was something in that, in the honesty of those 3 words, that I actually appreciated. I think you're working things out, I said. And I hope you get to a place that feels real for you. I genuinely do. But that place isn't back here. We stayed on the phone a little longer. Not fighting, not making promises. Just 2 people who had once shared a life talking at the edge of what had been. Looking at it together the way you look at something from a careful distance when you know better than to get closer. She asked about my job. I told her about the promotion. She said, you sound different. I am different, I said. Good different, she asked. Yeah, I said. Good different. Before we hung up, she said, I'm sorry for the way things went. For not being braver sooner. Don't be sorry, I said. It went the way it needed to go. And I meant it. Every word. After I hung up, I sat on the couch for a while. The light outside had gone that deep blue of early summer evenings that lasts longer than you expect. I thought about what she'd said. I wish you'd fought for it. And I thought about what fighting for it would have looked like. More years of 2 people sitting in the same room, staring at different walls. More mornings of conversations that circled and never landed. More of the quiet, accumulating unhappiness that neither of us had been willing to name. I had fought for it, in the only way that actually mattered. I had hurt her. I had let it end cleanly. And then I had fought, not for something I'd lost, but for something I hadn't yet built. There's a difference, a significant one. I called Nina that evening. We had been seeing each other officially since April. Not urgently, not desperately. In the way of 2 people who have both made mistakes and learned from them, and are now choosing deliberately and without rush. She answered the way she always did, like she'd been half expecting it to be me. Hey, she said. Hey, I said. Claire called. Oh, she said. Quiet. Steady. She wanted to revisit things, I said. A beat. And, she said. And I told her I'd built a life, I said. Another beat. And then I heard her exhale, just slightly. How do you feel? She asked. And I looked out the window at the last of the evening light and the city humming below me and thought about that question with the honest attention it deserved. Clear, I said. Good clear or complicated clear? She asked. Just clear, I said. She said, come over. And I did. There is something I want to say to anyone who is in the middle of what I was in the beginning of. Not advice, I'm not that. Just something I noticed. The moment I stopped trying to hold something together that was already done being held, everything I'd been spending my energy on suddenly became available for something else. For the gym, for the woodworking, for the hikes and the markets and the bread and the honey and the mornings, for the apartment with east windows, for the friend I'd let drift and got back, for the version of myself that had been standing quietly behind the version I'd been performing for years. That version had been patient, remarkably patient. It had been waiting for me to stop looking backward long enough to take a step forward. And the step forward, when I finally took it, didn't feel like recovery. It felt like beginning. I went back to the woodworking class that fall. The new session, same Tuesday evenings, same Weston with his impossibly steady hands. He recognized me when I walked in. Back for more, he said. Back for more, I said. He nodded like that was the only acceptable answer. What are you building this time, he asked. I'd already decided. A bookshelf, I said. He studied me for a moment. That's a project, he said. Not just a weekend thing. I know, I said. He handed me a pencil and a piece of paper and told me to start with measurements. And I sat down at the long table in that quiet studio with sawdust on the floor and tools on the walls and the smell of cut pine in the air, and I drew the outline of something I was going to build from scratch. And I felt, completely and without any reservation, exactly like myself. There is a version of this story where I become bitter, where the call from Claire confirms something dark about people and relationships and the futility of opening yourself up to anything. That is not the story. There is a version where I go back, where I tell myself that a familiar unhappiness is better than the uncertainty of something new, where I mistake comfort for connection and history for love. That is not this story either. This is the version where I heard my wife say she'd outgrown something and believed her completely, where I honored what she said by not fighting it, where I turned around from a closed door and found out slowly, unglamorously, with a lot of early mornings and bad box joints, what I was actually made of, where I built a life that fit me. And when she came back and looked for the space she'd left behind, she found that the space had been filled, not with bitterness, not with replacement, with presence, with purpose, with someone who had finally, after a long time of forgetting, decided to actually live in his own life. The bookshelf took 11 weeks. I finished it on a Saturday morning in December, 2 days before my birthday. I stood it up against the wall of the apartment and stepped back and looked at it. It was not perfect. One of the shelf supports was 2 millimeters off, and it created a very slight slant that only I could see. But it was solid, and it was real, and every inch of it was mine. I put books on it that afternoon, the ones I'd actually read in the past year, which were more than I'd read in the 3 years before it combined. Nina came by later and stood in front of it and ran her hand along one of the shelves the way Weston had taught me to check for smoothness. "You made this," she said. It wasn't a question. "I made that," I said. She turned and looked at me in the way that good people look at you when they see something clearly and want you to know they see it. "You're proud of it," she said. "Yeah," I said. "You should be," she said. And we had dinner. And the evening was easy and warm and full of the kind of unhurried conversation that happens between two people who aren't performing anything for anyone. And later, when the apartment was quiet and the city was doing its nighttime hum outside the east windows, I thought about the kitchen counter and the coffee mug and the words that had started all of this. I think I've outgrown this marriage. And I thought about what I wanted to say to that version of myself standing at the counter. What I would tell him. I think I'd say, "Thank you for not fighting it. Thank you for hearing her. Thank you for walking out of that kitchen and into the first real year of your life. Thank you for keeping the promises you made to yourself when no one was watching. And thank you for building something so complete, so fully yours, that when someone came back looking for a chapter, there wasn't an empty page left to write it on."